They didn't just remove a book. They erased a worldview. The Book of Jubilees wasn't taken away because it lacked meaning, but because it carried too much. It offered a rhythm to life that challenged the systems built later. It didn't fit the rewritten narrative, so it had to be cut out. But what happens when you remove a piece of sacred truth? You don't just lose a story, you lose orientation. You lose time. You lose clarity about purpose. That's what happened when the Book of Jubilees was taken away. It wasn't a forgotten scroll. It was a foundational blueprint for sacred time, divine order, and ancestral responsibility. And central to its rhythm was Africa. The Book of Jubilees presents time not in chaos but in cycles. It offers a divine calendar that doesn't follow man-made systems but sacred sequences, weeks of years, cycles of 7, jubilees every 49. This book didn't teach people to chase time. It taught them to live in it, to honor it, to rest, to release, to remember. In a world today where time feels like a burden, this book framed it as a blessing. And that's dangerous to the systems that thrive on exhaustion. You see, when people know the true rhythm of life, when they stop rushing, stop consuming without pause, stop grinding without purpose, they become harder to control. They become rooted. And the Book of Jubilees was deeply rooted in African soil, in African time, in the seasons of a land that knew when to sow, when to reap, and when to rest. That's why the removal wasn't random. It was intentional. Because if you teach a people their time doesn't matter, it's easier to convince them they don't matter. If you sever them from the sacred, they'll spend their lives trying to earn what was already theirs. Jubilees reminded people of covenant, of liberation, of land. Every 50 years was a return, a reset, a chance to restore what had been lost. That's not just spiritual, that's revolutionary, especially for a people whose history has been built around forced dislocation. The book pointed to a system where no one stays enslaved, no debt lasts forever, no injustice gets to live indefinitely. Every wrong was called into alignment with time. And when you take that truth away, oppression doesn't just persist, it becomes normalized. The African roots of this story are undeniable. The very setting of sacred time was in a land that birthed rivers, civilizations, languages, and laws long before colonization ever touched the soil. The people who first heard these cycles didn't need clocks or calendars. They lived by the sky, the stars, the moon, and the soil. Their sense of time wasn't mechanical. It was spiritual. It was embodied. They moved with creation, not against it. And that is what the Book of Jubilees echoes. It calls back to a rhythm that many of us today have lost. Not because we forgot, but because we were taught to forget. Stripped from our roots, we were given artificial time. Time to produce, time to serve others, time to work without rest, but no time to return, no time to reset, no time to be free. In the Book of Jubilees, even freedom had a schedule. It wasn't a wish, it was written in time itself. That kind of knowledge can't survive in a world built on control. So they took it away. They told us it didn't belong. They buried it under doctrine. But the truth doesn't stay buried. And now we're beginning to remember, not just the words, but the rhythm of sacred time, the rhythm of rest and return, the rhythm that says we were never meant to live in chaos. We were meant to live in cycles that restore us, that return us to self, that bring us back to purpose. It's no coincidence that Africa, the very land that gave birth to sacred time, is the same land where people's time has been most violated. Colonized, divided, renamed. But even through that, something remained. A pulse, a memory, a cycle deep in the soul. That's why the Book of Jubilees matters. Not just as scripture, but as a key to realign our lives. To know when to work, but also when to stop. To know when to build, but also when to let go. To know that nothing broken has to stay that way forever. That is the power of divine time. That is the beauty of Jubilees. And now people are waking up, rediscovering what was hidden, asking questions they were told not to ask, searching through texts that were excluded. And what they're finding isn't rebellion, it's restoration. They're learning that divine order didn't begin with colonization. It began with creation. And creation's first rhythm was time. Days, nights, Sabbaths, seasons, all pointing to something more than survival, pointing to a life of balance, of return, of wholeness. That's what was taken from us. That's what we're reclaiming. When you understand the African roots of sacred time, you stop living by someone else's clock. You begin to live by design, not by demand. You begin to see rest as holy, not lazy. You see release not as weakness, but as wisdom. The Book of Jubilees was removed because it reminded people that time was not a chain. It was a gift. It reminded people that they were not slaves to the calendar, but stewards of time. And most importantly, it reminded a scattered people that return was always part of the promise. That no matter how far they'd been taken, they were never outside of time's grace. That is a message worth recovering. Because in that message is freedom, in that rhythm is healing, in that cycle is justice, and in that time is a call, one we can hear even now, a call back to truth, a call back to self, a call back to the rhythm of our ancestors, who didn't just survive history, but understood it better than any textbook ever could. They knew when to rest, they knew when to rise, they knew when to wait, and they knew when to return. That's what we are doing now, returning, not to the past, but to the pattern, not to pain, but to power, not to slavery, but to sacred time. That's what the Book of Jubilees still speaks. And now we are finally listening. The disappearance of the Book of Jubilees from most religious canons was not an oversight or a theological adjustment. It was part of a deliberate and structured campaign to erase knowledge that could empower those whose identity was systematically attacked. The absence of this sacred text removed more than just a record of events. It stripped away a worldview, a rhythm, a spiritual calendar, and a deep African legacy of wisdom. And when we ask why it was erased, we're not just exploring a lost book. We're uncovering a pattern that sought to disrupt the alignment between people and divine order. That kind of disconnection doesn't happen by mistake. It happens with intention. Jubilees was filled with cycles, measured time, sacred rest, and restoration woven into the fabric of existence. It taught that time wasn't linear chaos. It was sacred order, a divine design that repeated like the seasons, like breath, like the sunrise. These were not abstract ideas. They were deeply rooted in African experience, in the rhythms of the earth, in the connection between sky and soil, spirit and season. To erase that text meant to cut people off from that memory, to detach future generations from a divine system that had guided their ancestors long before colonization. That kind of erasure has consequences that stretch far beyond theology. It shapes how a people think, live, rest, and dream. To rewrite time is to rewrite destiny. By removing texts like Jubilees, those in power shifted the axis of what was considered sacred. They forced foreign timelines, inserted unnatural holidays, and replaced indigenous cycles with systems that prioritized labor over liberation, profit over peace, and conformity over creation. When African descended people were taught to abandon their original structure of sacred time, they were taught to abandon the rhythm that once kept their communities spiritually aligned and balanced. This was not spiritual improvement. It was a form of colonized control. Time is not neutral. How we mark it determines how we live. The Book of Jubilees represented time in a way that honored land, family, forgiveness, and rhythm. And all of that pointed back to a divine structure, one that didn't depend on empires, economies, or exploitation to function. That's why it was dangerous. That's why it had to be silenced. Because if people realized that their original spiritual framework had never been broken, only buried, they would stop depending on systems that do not serve them. They would return to what was already there. And that kind of return scares those who profit from confusion. The silencing of Jubilees was part of a broader campaign to redefine the sacred in ways that excluded Africa. It wasn't just about suppressing a text. It was about suppressing a timeline, a way of knowing, a connection to the divine that wasn't filtered through external approval. When you remove the knowledge of cycles, you create generations who work endlessly without rest, who live disconnected from natural rhythms, who forget that even the soil has seasons and the soul needs Sabbaths. That's what the absence of Jubilees created. People disconnected from their ancestral memory, from a divine calendar that once helped them know when to plant, when to harvest, when to pause, when to forgive, and when to return. This was strategic. It was calculated, because the more disconnected a people are from sacred rhythm, the easier they are to exhaust, the easier they are to distract, the easier they are to keep occupied with systems that never lead to freedom. That's why reclaiming the knowledge hidden in the Book of Jubilees matters. It's not about romanticizing the past. It's about re-entering a rhythm that was never meant to be broken. A rhythm that honored every seventh year as a release, every seventh cycle as a jubilee. A rhythm that remembered that no bondage was meant to be permanent, that debts could be erased, that land returned, that justice was built into time itself. That's not just spiritual wisdom, that's revolution. To reclaim that rhythm is to resist systems of endless grind, of permanent oppression, of generational poverty. It is to remember that we were given a divine blueprint, one that prioritized restoration, not exploitation. The removal of Jubilees attempted to erase that map, but the map never died. It still lives in the soil, in the stories, in the bones of those who remember. And now that remembering is happening again, quietly, powerfully, as people begin to reject false timelines, question artificial order, and reconnect with the divine pulse that was always theirs. This isn't just about theology, it's about time. It's about knowing who you are, not just spiritually, but cyclically. And once that rhythm is remembered, there is no going back. They never told you that time was meant to liberate you. They conditioned you to believe that time was something to chase, something to fear, something always running out. But long before clocks ticked and calendars dictated your every move, time was sacred. It was a rhythm, a cycle that restored more than land. It restored people. It wasn't something to be feared. It was something to be lived in. In ancient African wisdom, time moved like nature. It was alive. It had breath. It had purpose. There were seasons for work, for stillness, for returning, and for releasing. Time was divine, not mechanical. But when that truth was hidden, time became a weapon. When you strip a people of their sacred rhythm, you don't just confuse their days, you confuse their identity. You remove the pauses that give breath to their purpose. You remove the healing that was meant to happen in rest. You remove the space where freedom could grow. What once moved with nature was replaced by pressure. The idea of Jubilee, as shown in the ancient scriptures, was not just ceremonial. It was liberation embedded into the flow of years. Every seventh cycle brought restoration. Debts were forgiven. The land was given rest. Families returned home. That kind of structure was not just spiritual, it was revolutionary. It stopped exploitation before it became generational. But when Jubilee was erased from the practice of the people, oppression gained momentum. Without rest, exhaustion became normal. Without return, displacement became permanent. Without reset, injustice became tradition. Suddenly, the very idea of rest was reframed as laziness. The act of releasing burdens was seen as weakness. Time was no longer a servant. It became a master. And that shift didn't happen accidentally. It was crafted, taught, enforced. Because a tired people won't resist. A disoriented people won't remember. And a people who can't remember can't return to what they've lost. In ancient African traditions, time was never something owned. It was something shared. It belonged to the land, the sun, the moon, the creator, and the people. Everyone moved together in rhythm. That meant when the land rested, so did the people. When it was time to release, the society obeyed that sacred call. There was balance, there was flow, and in that flow there was peace. But systems that profit from imbalance cannot coexist with sacred timing. So they rewrote time. They replaced cycles with deadlines, replaced restoration with production, replaced grace with grind. Now we live in a world that never stops. A world where people are praised for working without sleeping, where rest is rewarded only when it follows overwork, and where healing is considered a luxury. That is not divine. That is not the design we came from. We come from people who knew that you cannot honor creation without honoring time. You cannot serve your spirit if you never allow it to breathe. The Book of Jubilees pointed us to a rhythm where every soul had a reset, where justice had a timeline, and where no bondage was supposed to last forever. That rhythm has not vanished. It has been buried. But the deeper you dig, the more you feel it calling. They didn't just remove a book, they disrupted a sacred blueprint. And yet that rhythm still pulses in our bones. You feel it every time your soul cries for rest. You hear it every time your body resists being pushed too far. You sense it every time you long for restoration. But don't have the words. That's not weakness. That's memory. Your spirit remembers a time when time belonged to you, when the year included pauses to breathe, when wealth was measured by alignment, not accumulation, when healing was scheduled, not postponed, when time was a gift, not a burden. Returning to that rhythm isn't about going backward. It's about waking up. It's about living in a truth that predates oppression. It's about recognizing that you were never created to be ruled by urgency. You were created to thrive within divine flow. The lie says that you are only valuable when you're producing. The truth says you are most powerful when you are aligned. And alignment comes from rhythm, not rush. That rhythm still exists. It's waiting. In nature, in silence, in cycle, in the ancient truths that whisper beneath the noise of modern confusion. You can't build freedom on stolen time. You can't inherit peace in systems designed for constant motion. To reclaim time is to reclaim self. To honor sacred rhythm is to say, I will no longer live by what breaks me. I will live by what restores me. And restoration is not passive. It is the most radical act of resistance in a world addicted to exhaustion. Sacred time was never meant to control you. It was meant to free you. And that freedom begins when you stop running and start remembering. When you live not by the clock, but by the call of your own divine rhythm. They didn't erase that book because it was irrelevant. They removed it because it held too much power. Power not just in words, but in rhythm, in structure, in divine timing. That wasn't man-made. The Book of Jubilees didn't speak to chaos or confusion. It spoke to balance, to sacred alignment, to justice that returned on a schedule. When they took it out, they didn't just remove a text. They broke a chain of memory. They interrupted a pattern that was designed to keep people spiritually synchronized with creation, with community, and with Creator. And that break wasn't a loss of pages, it was a loss of rhythm. There was a time when people didn't chase moments, they flowed with them. They understood the language of the earth, the timing of the seasons, the value of pausing. Every seventh year had meaning. Every cycle had restoration built into it. The Book of Jubilees wasn't just about religious events. It was a guide to living in alignment with divine purpose. It marked moments not just for celebration, but for release, for returning what was borrowed, for healing what had been wounded. It didn't promote exhaustion. It introduced patterns that refresh. But such structure could never survive under a world system built on endless consumption and constant labor. When sacred cycles were erased, oppression didn't just become a social condition, it became a spiritual fracture. People were disconnected from the rhythm that once reminded them they weren't created to grind without grace, that they weren't meant to work without rest, to carry forever what was supposed to be lifted after a time. That disconnection became generational, and the more disconnected people became from that rhythm, the easier it was to control them. When a person forgets the value of time, they surrender to whatever system defines it for them. In its original form, time was holy. It wasn't a threat, it was a signal, a reminder that everything has a moment, and every moment had a sacred task. It was designed not to wear you down, but to lift you back up again. But once time was reshaped into pressure, into deadlines, into race against the clock, it lost its divine voice. Now most people live rushing, striving, collapsing under weight. They were never meant to carry endlessly. They measure worth by how busy they are. They feel guilt for resting. They forget that restoration was once law, not luxury. You can see the effect of the removal all around us. Rest is discouraged, recovery is delayed, forgiveness is rare, and returning what was stolen is almost unthinkable. The original text taught otherwise. It showed that every cycle had its return, that no damage lasted forever, and that time itself would demand correction. This wasn't a hopeful idea. It was built into creation, and that's what was removed. Not just truth, but rhythm. Not just a scroll, but the reminder that the soul needs pause, that the land needs to breathe, that justice isn't random. Its structure. Africa was never separate from that structure. The continent didn't just birth humanity. It nurtured wisdom, language, science, and spiritual order. The Book of Jubilees reflected the rhythms already present in African soil, in indigenous calendars, in the way people related to nature and to each other. So when it was taken, a part of that divine connection was hidden, but not destroyed. Because you cannot destroy truth, you can only delay its return. And that return is what's happening now, not through institutions, but through awakening. People are remembering what their ancestors didn't forget. That there was a time when days had meaning beyond the clock, that moments were sacred, and that rest wasn't for the weak. It was part of the design. We come from those who honored divine cycles, who knew when to let go, when to forgive, when to stand still, and when to act. That wisdom is not lost. It's weighted beneath layers of noise, tradition, and distortion. But it speaks through silence, through fatigue that won't go away, through the longing for something deeper than just surviving. That's the echo of sacred time, calling back. Reclaiming that rhythm won't be easy, because the world profits from your exhaustion. It sells solutions to problems it created by stealing your pause. But when you start living by divine rhythm again, everything changes. You begin to see the false urgency. You begin to resist the lie that says your value comes from endless performance. You remember that sacred timing doesn't rush. It restores. And when you step into that, you step out of bondage. You begin to live not by reaction, but by purpose, not by pressure, but by flow. The cycles are still here. The rhythm is still available. The truth is still alive. The book may have been removed, but its message lives on, in the way the earth turns, in the way your soul craves rest, in the knowing that justice is overdue, and return is needed. And you don't need permission to step back into alignment. You only need awareness, and once you remember, you don't walk like everyone else. You don't live on borrowed time. You live in sacred rhythm, and that changes everything. They never taught you the power of stillness, because stillness couldn't be taxed. They never praised your rest, because rested people can't be pushed or manipulated. Rest wasn't simply about sleep. It was about reclaiming control over your time, your body, your mind, your decisions. That kind of power challenges everything this world is built on. You see, if you ever understood the divine structure behind rest, you'd stop grinding for things that already belong to you. You'd stop measuring success by how much you sacrifice and start measuring it by how aligned you are with truth. The ancient people didn't view rest as something optional. It was commanded by rhythm, by seasons, by the sky itself. It was a way of living in step with creation, not in conflict with it. When you strip away rest from a people, you remove their ability to hear. You remove the silence where clarity lives. You replace it with noise, distraction, and exhaustion, so that even when they try to stop, their minds can't. That's not just physical fatigue. That's spiritual attack. When the Book of Jubilees was taken out, it wasn't just scripture they erased. They erased a template for resistance, a map for resetting, a schedule for relief, because every seventh year meant something was supposed to break. Bonds, debts, oppression. Rest in that rhythm wasn't passive. It was warfare against a system that demanded more than it gave. It was rebellion in a world that glorified non-stop labor. Look around you today. The people most exploited are the ones denied the right to stop. Generations have grown up believing their value is only seen through work, through movement, through sacrifice. But the Book of Jubilees taught otherwise. It said there is a time to cease, a time to return, a time to let go. These weren't suggestions. They were spiritual laws that protected the land, the soul, and the community. They created space for people to breathe, to be, to reset. That's what they erased. Not just a book, but a buffer against burnout. Rest wasn't selfish, it was sacred. Forgiving wasn't weakness, it was restoration. Giving land back wasn't a threat. It was justice encoded in divine time. They didn't want that system remembered because if it ever returned, the foundations of greed and control would collapse. A society that honors rest cannot be controlled by fear. A culture that knows when to stop cannot be manipulated by urgency. When the people live by divine cycles, the manufactured deadlines lose power. The lie is that success requires non-stop effort, that the only path to growth is through sacrifice. But the truth has always been different. Growth also happens in silence, in stillness, in surrender. That's what divine timing teaches. That release is just as holy as work. That rest is not absence, it's present. The present moment, honored without guilt or apology. That's the system they didn't want passed down, because if the people remembered it, they'd stop running toward things they never needed to chase. You're not here just to survive. You're not here to live under pressure that never lets up. The original design gave you permission to rest without falling behind. It created a world where everything had its place, and that included peace. That included stillness. That included the radical act of stop. Today, when you take a moment to rest, to reflect, to say enough for now, you are not being lazy. You are living in defiance of systems that never wanted you to pause. Because every pause is power. Every moment you say no to chaos. You say yes to clarity. And what happens when enough people reclaim that rhythm? Everything begins to shift. The ground under exploitation shakes. The weight of generational fatigue lifts. Communities begin rebuild on truth, not survival. Families reconnect not through urgency, but through presence. That is what sacred time does. It reconnects what the world broke. It brings balance where there was only imbalance. And that kind of order doesn't come from laws or governments. It comes from returning to a deeper original pattern that predates all of this confusion. So don't believe the voice that tells you to keep pushing until you break. That voice was never divine. It was designed to distract you from what your spirit already knows. You were not made for endless work. You were made for cycles of labor. Yes, but also of relief, of striving, but also of surrender. And in that surrender, you find wisdom. You find your ancestors. You find the rhythm they once moved in before it was stolen. The truth is, reclaiming that rhythm now is not only your right, it's your responsibility. Because the more you align with it, the more others will follow. You don't have to fix everything overnight, but you can begin by honoring the next pause. You can begin by releasing what was never yours to carry forever. You can begin by saying that your time matters, that your rest matters, that your peace isn't earned, it's inherited. That's the revolution they never saw coming. A people who rest in their truth can no longer be used. A people who honor divine rhythm will never be ruled by chaos. You cannot build anything lasting if the foundation is broken. And the foundation was never just land or language. It was time. It was the rhythm that guided communities long before invasion and interference, long before their calendars were replaced and their seasons renamed. Time wasn't something they followed. It was something they lived in. It wasn't simply a tool to measure hours or schedule appointments. It was a sacred rhythm that breathed through the people, the soil, the stars, and the spirit. When colonization came, it didn't only take resources, it stole time. It disrupted cycles that had kept people balanced, aware, connected, and whole. When that rhythm was stripped away, it wasn't just about productivity, it was about identity. When you no longer know the sacred structure of your days, you begin to drift. You start chasing meaning instead of living in it. Your steps speed up. but your direction fades. You wake up tired and go to sleep numb because you're operating on a frequency that was never meant for you. And the more you push, the more disconnected you become from the very rhythm that once centered your ancestors. This is how a people forget themselves, not because they want to, but because they are cut off from the very cycles that once reminded them of who they were. The future cannot be rewritten until the original time is reclaimed. The patterns of life that were dismissed as primitive were in fact profound. They weren't just agricultural, they were spiritual. They marked moments to stop and reflect, to forgive and reset, to realign with nature, with family, with spirit. These were not just dates, they were instructions. Instructions that told communities when to heal, when to sow, when to gather, and when to release. And all of it was rooted in time. That wasn't manipulated by greed or interrupted by conquest. It was divine, it was intentional, and it was deeply African. What was lost wasn't just routine, it was a relationship with time. Once sacred pauses were removed, rest became rare. Once Jubilee cycles were erased, debt became lifelong. Once balance was dismissed, hustle became constant. And soon people didn't just lose freedom, they forgot what it felt like. That is how powerful sacred time is. It doesn't just schedule you, it shapes you, it holds memory. It carries the wisdom of generations that knew how to move in harmony with everything around them. The weather didn't surprise them, the harvest didn't confuse them. Their bodies weren't in conflict with their pace. They lived in sync with something that modern systems cannot replicate. Divine order. Reclaiming that order isn't about turning back the clock. It's about repairing what was damaged when foreign systems replaced original truths. Colonization didn't just enslave bodies, it colonized time. It rewrote what was sacred and redefined what was valuable. Suddenly fast was better than steady, and more was better than meaningful. But if you look closer, those old cycles are still speaking. They're still humming beneath the noise. The soul still recognizes what the mind has forgotten, that there is a beat inside everything, that there is a return waiting in every pause, that there is power not just in movement, but in remembering how and when to be still. This kind of remembering doesn't come through history books, it comes through awakening, through listening to what your spirit has been whispering while the world told you to keep running. It comes when you look at the pace of nature and realize it was never designed to be rushed. Trees take time, rivers take time, healing takes time. And time is not the enemy, it's the structure that delivers restoration when it is honored. What was stolen must be returned, not only in the form of land or wealth, but in the knowledge of divine cycles that once made life whole. You weren't created to function like a machine. You weren't designed to exist in burnout, constantly surviving instead of living. Your ancestors didn't need alarms to know when to rise. They didn't need devices to tell them when to stop. Their bodies, their hearts, their spirits moved with time that was alive. And when you begin to tap into that again, you don't just reclaim peace, you reclaim clarity. You begin to see what no longer belongs. You begin to reject what steals from your soul. You begin to release the weight of systems that only offer stress in place of structure. That's why the future must be rebuilt on rhythm, not reaction. You can't keep moving forward while tied to time that was never yours. You need the pulse of sacred order, the one that makes space for rest, for realignment, for justice. The one that says you don't have to earn your worth every day, that you already carry it. That every seventh cycle was meant for release. That Jubilee wasn't a suggestion, it was part of your design. The truth was hidden, not destroyed. And now it's returning. Not as nostalgia, but as necessity. Because healing doesn't happen on borrowed time. It happens when we come back into rhythm, and that rhythm never left. It was just waiting for us to remember.